Awesome, everybody. So in our last lecture, we went pretty far with creating a queue with our OOP concepts, and we ran into this issue where I said, okay, for item in queue, print item. Now, in general, the way that our code works, and we can take a look at this iterator concept, is that every time that you have a container object, a list, a set, a structure, a dictionary, a tuple, we're going to be looping over them using a for loop. And this is actually built into Python as an iter method. So essentially, when you call for something in something, you're calling this method called iter. And what iter returns is actually a next method right here. So what we could do here, what we could do here is essentially go through each of the items and try to print them out. But if we want to go ahead and try to, in your homework, this is similar to, try to return something that we can iterate over, what we'll need to do here is overload the iter method right here. Because the iter method is called whenever we call a for loop. Now, if I do def of iter itself, what do I want to do? I want to return an object that Python will iterate over. So what I can actually return here is the iterative representation, IETR, of, and what is the object that I'm looping over here? I'm technically not looping over this entire object, right? This is a separate object. What am I looping over? Just this guy in here, the piece of data that's holding all the other strings of data that I have. So what I could say here is return the iterative representation of self.myQ. Now if I do for item in queue, print item, we'll see here that I get Duchess and John printed out. Now, this is a bit of an issue though, right? Because what's happening is that it's printing out everything from left to right. So for your homework assignment 2, this is fine to do if you're, because what you're asked to do is to save a bunch of items into a list that you create in your class. It's going to be very similar to this as a hint. And you're going to be asked to be able to loop through those items a part of that class, which is what will be going on here essentially. But what happens if we want to create a custom iterator? What happens if I want to say essentially to Python, hey, don't return them from left to right, return them from right to left. I want John to go before Duchess here. What we could do here is actually create a custom class. I'm going to call a queue iterator for the time being, like so. And what I'm going to do is essentially create a snippet of code that goes from the inverse. So instead of starting at the 0th element of my list, I'm going to start at the -1th element of my list. And if we see here, what I can do to do that is I'm going to create my initializer. And then I'm going to start it up at my queue. So whatever object I've created here, I'm going to say queue. So essentially, I'll call this given queue for the time being so that we can give this queue to it. And what I'll say here, I'm going to go ahead and create an index, maybe a start index. And what I want this to do is to start at the opposite end of my code. Now, so the way that I can do, of my list, and the way that I can do that is by going to the length of the given queue -1. So if my queue has 2 items in it, that means that I have 2 minus 1, which is 1. And that makes sense because Duchess is at the 0th index and John is at the 1 index. So that's what's happening here. You go to the full range of the list and you subtract 1 to go backwards. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create another self variable of my queue and then give it to the given queue. Now, this might be confusing. Let me actually call this queue so we don't get these confused together. These are not the same items right now. They don't reference each other until it's referencing this given queue that's given there. Nice. Now, excuse me, if we look back on our notes, we'll notice that whenever we make an iter method, what it's actually doing is it's returning an object with the next method. So essentially, if you don't want to use the basic iterator of Python, if you want to use a custom iterator that you're working with, what you're going to want to do, if you want to replace this with queue iterator, is you're going to need to overload the next operation. So the next operation is going to be a very default 0, 1, 2, print out whatever's in there. What we could do here of self essentially is return, we could say something like this, return self .q at the index of self.index. Now let's see what's going on here. Let's just see what happens if I run my code one more time. For item in queue, print item, Duchess and John again. What happens if I, instead of using a queue iterator, I use a custom iterator? A queue iterator like this guy. Let's go ahead and try to run my code. We'll see here that I actually get a ton of Johns printed out. So I'm actually having an infinite loop of these returns happening. Now there's a certain... Oh, we don't have it in the notes just yet, but essentially to avoid this from happening, what you would want to do, two things, is that the next is always going to be running until you encounter a special error that's called stop iteration. Stop iteration, let me make a comment of it here, is this special error that goes ahead and tells us, hey, go ahead and don't iterate anymore, just leave it to where it is, and that's what stops our queue. And the way that we want to stop our iteration is if our self.index, let's just say that we're going from right to left this time, or from our queue, if we are underneath 0, we don't have a negative 1th index or negative 2 or negative 3. We technically do, but for our purposes, what I want to do is that if I go ahead and I have my index less than 0, what I want to do is to stop my iteration. We'll see that it's purple, and you'll see here, signal the end from iterator.next. That's essentially, so this is a built-in method of Python that says, hey, go ahead and stop the for loop. Let's go ahead and see what happens here. If I do this again. Now I'm getting an error. John is constantly running for me for some reason, and the reason that it's most likely happening is that I'm not decrementing my index. So I could do self.index is equal to self.index minus 1. And now I'm going to be able to reach this case where I have it less than 0. Let's do for item in queue. Nice. And it looks like I'm getting Duchess and John again, which is unfortunate because it looks like I automatically decrement my 1. It looks like I'm decrementing my 1 instead of the 0 right away. So what I'll do here is I'm instead going to return results. And what I'll put result as is self.queue of self.index. And then instead of returning this guy, I'm going to return my result. So essentially, I'm going to save the value of index at the start. I'm going to decrement index after that, and then I'm going to return the saved value that I found. So what I'll do here now, for item in queue, print item. Nice. And now it looks like I'm getting John and Duchess. So now instead of getting Duchess and John like normal, I'm actually getting a more custom iterator. And let's go ahead and see how many times this could work for us. Let me try to in-queue a few different people. Let's just say they're all like testing dummies. Test 2, test 3. So each of these guys are getting in-queued, and they're going on a list from left to right. What should happen now? See, like this. I get John, test 1, test 2, test 3. And now again, the issue here is if I just went ahead and I did code like this, where I just returned a basic iterator, we'll see that I actually get the inverse of what my list was there. Cool. So the queue iterator is a bit complicated, and I know we just learned a lot of OOP, so this might be a lot at once, but don't worry too much about the iteration as much as understanding that next is what runs inside of a for loop. And excuse me, if you're making an abstract data type, and you will be doing this for assignment 2, where you're keeping track of a class object in a class that's dedicated to it. So like you're keeping track of a bunch of patients in a class that's called patient manager. If you keep them in a list and you want to iterate through that list of objects, what you do is something like this, where you say, okay, I created an abstract data type list up here. I'm going to say self.myQ is equal to the brackets, empty list. Now, if I want to use it to say for item in queue, you're going to need to tell Python to say, okay, this person wants to do a for loop, overload my for loop and give them this. And then if you want to get even more complicated with it, if you want to create a custom return iterator for it, you can create a secondary class that overloads the next operation for us. Let me go ahead and say something like this, just so that we can have it in our notes. Awesome. So There's quite a bit going on here. Abstract data types are very useful in Python, but please, what I want you to focus on is get down inheritance and the object-oriented programming. If this is a bit hazy, don't worry too much about it. Focus more so on lectures 2.2 to 2.4 a bit more. But please let me know if you have any questions as well.